one of the claims that's always thrown at the Soviet Union was that it was this totalitarian, authoritarian dictatorship. Nobody had any say in their workplaces, in the political life of the country. Everything was just run by bureaucrats, and at the top of it all was Stalin, the man who essentially controlled everything in politics, everything within the private lives of the people of the Soviet Union, just everything. And of course, this has just been said so many times that nobody really cares about looking for any type of evidence in support of this. It's just taken as a granted. Even among those of the left, so many people buy into this idea. But how much of it is true? First, what does it mean when we think of democracy and dictatorship? Our typical conception of democracy is rule of the people, by the people, and for the people. The government is ran for the people, and it's made up of representative delegates of the people who are connected to the masses. And a dictatorship is essentially the rule of a few. Society is ran in spite of the masses, not because of them. So there's this common notion that Stalin was this one-man dictator. Everything he wanted got done. Well, it's actually very easy to disprove this. Numerous letters from the archives tell us that Stalin actually lost in the political arena a fair number of times, even with small things. For example, Stalin wanted Kaganovich as the candidate for the head of civil aviation. However, it was not Kaganovich that got the position, but Goldsman. And when it came to replacing someone as the head of the NKVD, a very important position, Stalin wanted Melenkov as the new head of the NKVD, but the Politburo put Beria in the position. Stalin was also constantly voted down when he was trying to reform the political system. He got some reforms through, but he could not implement all of them. So this really shows that Stalin really was not a dictator. He didn't have total control of the nation. So how did the political system of the Soviet Union work? Well, the long and short of it, people would elect a representative, and all these representatives would elect other positions of power, and all these lower positions of power were answerable to these elected delegates. That's a really short explanation. If you want a more in-depth explanation, I recommend watching the Finnish Bolsheviks video on the Soviet government and electoral systems. But even people who are anti-Soviet admit that this structure does seem democratic. What they attack is the elections. They state that the elections were undemocratic because there was only one candidate on the ballot and you could either accept or reject the candidate. Now this is true, but this is not the whole truth. The question is, how exactly were candidates nominated? Robert Hill, quoting a study by Shabanov, states that formal nomination takes place at meetings of workers' collectives where those present are encouraged to speak frankly about the personal qualities of the proposed candidates. So basically there's a meeting and people propose candidates, people talk about those qualifications of this candidate, and they elect whether or not they should go on to be the person up for election. So basically, if they've already made it to a voting stage, they've essentially already won. The voting is basically a finalization. There was a man named Pat Sloan who actually worked within the USSR. He was a British teacher who was working abroad, actually participated in these elections, and was actually there for the meetings. I have, while working in the Soviet Union, participated in an election. I too had the right to vote, as I was a working member of the community, and nationality and citizenship are no bar to electoral rights. The procedure was extremely simple. A general meeting of all workers in our organization was called by the trade union committee. Candidates were discussed, and a vote was taken by show of hands. Anyone present had the right to propose a candidate, and the one who was elected was not personally a member of the party. And considering the claims of the candidates, their past activities were discussed, they themselves had to answer questions as to their qualifications. Anybody can express an opinion for or against them, and the basis of all discussion was, what justification had the candidates to represent their comrades on the local Soviet? Nothing about this seems undemocratic whatsoever. It's a lot better than the system we have in place today, when you have two parties put up two candidates and you can choose between them. The Soviet system really feels like it had a good mix of direct and indirect democracy in its elections to higher positions. The Soviets also practiced a type of proto-mass line, which is making laws and policy in accordance to what the masses want. For example, the 1936 Constitution was pretty much all done through suggestion. Pat Sloan also recounts other cases such as abortion laws were also decided through the mass line. A big part of the Soviet Union was free criticism. Criticism of officials, criticism of working conditions, criticism of management. These were all done constantly. Pat Sloan's book testifies to this, as does other eyewitness accounts such as Sidney and Beatrice Webb. Free criticism, however hostile it may be, is permitted, even encouraged in the USSR, of the directors of all forms of enterprise, by workers employed, or by the consumers of the commodities or services concerned. And of course, now that the archives are released, we actually do see evidence of this. Robert Thurston, who studied the archives, states, "Of course, criticism had been strongly encouraged during the purges, and local records contain plenty of it. The press strongly endorsed criticism from below at the end of 1938. He also states, for example, in March 1931, Stalin emphasized the importance of the party's ties to the masses. To maintain them, it was necessary to listen carefully to the voices of the masses, to the voice of the rank-and-file members of the party, to the voice of the so-called little people, to the voice of the ordinary folk, Narod." Pravda went so far as to identify lack of criticism with enemies of the people. Only an enemy is interested in seeing that we, the Bolsheviks, do not notice actual reality. Only an enemy strives to put rose-colored glasses of self-satisfaction over the eyes of our people. As the Zawodi materials and mass of other evidence show, these calls were by no means merely a vicious sham that permitted only carefully chosen reliable individuals to make safe criticisms. This is again practicing the mass line tactic of criticism, which I noted before. Thurston in his book also talks about how there was a commission to investigate these criticisms and actually work to answer them and resolve them. There was lower-level bureaucracy which tried to stop this criticism. Criticism of this kind is obviously detrimental to certain types of management and opportunists. Bourgeois scholar David Granick, in the book Red Executive, states, "Management is operating under severe ideological and practical handicaps in its efforts to keep down worker criticism. One factory director implied that production meetings were a real ordeal for him, but at a question as to whether workers dared criticize him openly, he said, any director who suppressed criticism would be severely punished. He would not only be removed, he would be tried." So the masses were taken seriously. They had valid say within the society in which they lived. Information like this is what led non-communist historian Robert Thurston to reject the standard Cold War totalitarian model of the Soviet state. Elsewhere, an essay of his published in a mainstream Soviet history book states that workers in the city, which supposedly suffered at least as much as any other in the Great Terror, were still able to criticize a director to his face and apparently get his job back after cursing a supervisor. While sane, calm, and sober, no worker would have dared to say that socialism was a poor system or that Stalin was an idiot. But such bounds allowed a great deal that was deeply significant to the workers, including some aspect of production norms, pay rates, and classification, safety on the job, housing, and treatment of managers. This occurred at a time when American workers in particular were struggling for basic union recognition, which even when won, did not provide much formal influence at the workplace. Far from basing its rule on the negative means of coercion, the Soviet regime in the late 1930s fostered a limited but positive political role for the populace. At lower levels of society, in day-to-day affairs and the implementation of policy, the Soviet political structure was participatory. Earlier concepts of the Soviet state require rethinking. The workers who ousted managers achieved imprisonment of their targets, and won reinstatement at factories did so through organizations which constituted part of the state apparatus and wielded state powers. Only by staying on the surface of the story and limiting the use of evidence to certain kinds of sources can the system be described as one in which coercion overwhelmingly determined the course of workers' lives. This and similar issues meant that ultimately relatively little was controlled by the government or party decree, which often expressed pious wishes rather than commands which were then fulfilled. Another historian, J.H. Ketty, studied the Smolensk archives and came to the conclusion that there is not enough unity in the political system to actually be totalitarian in practice. The Soviet state couldn't practically implement it. So even non-communist historians state that this totalitarian conception of Soviet life is flawed. Workers did have legitimate control over their workplaces and over society. Now there is a question of the party. As so often it's pointed to that since there was one party, that means that the system was undemocratic. Well, it's only undemocratic if the people actually want another political party, and it's only undemocratic if the people who control the party are other than the people themselves. A two-party structure essentially presents a system where you vote for the person you hate the least, as is so often the case nowadays. What's important is to have control over who is nominated for certain positions, and actually more than two parties is actually very, very detrimental to democracy, as proven by something called May's theorem. There's a good video series by Carneades, which goes more into why more than two parties is harmful to democracy. So a one-party system isn't any more or less undemocratic than a two- or three-party system. What matters is who controls this party. Now, you didn't have to be a member of the party to get elected. And as Pat Sloan's investigations revealed, if the people didn't like you, even if you're part of the party, you're not going to get set up for nomination. The election he witnessed didn't even have a party member get elected. So often the party members were popular with the masses, however, so they often got elected. Also, really wasn't much need for any other type of party since the Communist Party already represented the will of the workers. But that can change. Stalin recognized that party control could become corrupted. His long-term solution was to reform the Soviet system, making the party more or less an agitation propaganda apparatus. In the short term, however, he advocated for what's called party purges, not literal purging as in the sense of making arrests and such. The term purge more or less translates better into cleansing, a cleansing of the party, as well as having most of the party members be made up of the working class. Both of these did exist under Stalin. The huge majority of the Communist Party was made up of manual workers and peasants. Who exactly was in the party was subject to regular cleansings by the people. Quoting first-hand eyewitness Pat Sloan again, and how, it may be asked, was it to be ensured that those who were in the party should not become divorced from the rest of the population? Were there not dangers that a small political organization holding great power in its hands might become isolated from the people whom it professed to represent? It was precisely in order to combat this danger that Lenin took the initiative in organizing what has come to be known as the party cleansings, or party purgings, which consists of public meetings in town, village, and the army, where every few years party members must in public justify their membership of this party, which claims to be the organized vanguard of the working people. At such cleansings, which I have personally attended, every party member must give an account of his or her life, of the part they have played in the struggle for improved conditions of the working people, and of the work they are doing today. Any person present may put questions, any person present may speak, and so the merits of each party member are fully discussed. Another eyewitness account is Anna Louise Strong. She traveled the Soviet Union quite extensively, and she stated that the entire membership of the Communist Party was therefore subjected to what is called a cleansing or a purge in the presence of large audiences of their non-communist fellow workers. Each communist had to relate his life history and daily activities in the presence of people who were in a position to check them. It was a brutal experience for an unpopular president of a Moscow university to explain to an examining board in the presence of his students why he merited the nation's trust, or for a superintendent of a large plant to expose his life history and daily activities, even to his wife's use of one of the factory automobiles for shopping. In the presence of plant's workers, any one of whom had the right to make remarks. This was done with every communist throughout the country. It resulted in the expulsion of a large numbers from the party and in the arrest and trial of a few. So, at least under Stalin, the party was under the control of the workers. Workers had considerable say in their environment, over the economy, in their workplace, and in the political structure. They had the right to freely criticize management, freely criticize state policies. The mass line was implemented. Popular ideas were considered when making law. This was essentially what is called a dictatorship of the proletariat, in which the working class wielded political power instead of a whole bunch of rich people at the top. However, after the death of Stalin, he was slandered. His political reforms never took hold. The Communist Party experienced less and less membership of manual workers and peasants, and more that of intelligentsia. Political power was essentially slowly becoming deprived from the working class, to the point when it was non-existent. But evidence doesn't show that this happened under Stalin or Lenin, but under their predecessors, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and Gorbachev, who are typically seen as people who tried to introduce democratic rights into the USSR, not the reverse. This tells us that even when the revolution is over, there still exists another revolution against revisionism that will carry on for even 30, 40 years even after the initial violent revolution. The proletariat must strive to keep the system which they built. They still must fight for ideological superiority. First-hand accounts and archival records tell a very different story from that which we've heard from anti-Soviets. The Soviet Union was a legitimate dictatorship of the proletariat with a functioning proletarian democracy, at least under the time of Lenin and Stalin. Its downfall gives us practical knowledge to work with, to better our theory, and to help those in the future sustain any type of future proletarian democracies.